I'm going to ask now for all of our speakers really to join me on the panel. We've got a Q&A now, and we've got a whole series of questions which have come up. I'd also like to take the opportunity to introduce Cecilia Chavanna Bryant, who's here as Dr. Paguagua's translator. So Cecilia, if you could join us as well, that would be great. And I'm going to switch to gallery view. There we are. I can see you all now. Thank you. Good. Okay. Well, I'm going to use chairman's privilege, and I'm going to kick off with a question for Ori, which I have myself, and that's about hi Ori, good to see you virtually. About the Sternbergia clusiana that you mentioned, a beautiful geophyte there with the yellow flowers. You said that there are a few insects there to pollinate it, and it needs assisted pollination. Why is that? Is that because it has a specialist pollinator, or are there just have we seen just a general decline in insects?
Well, it's our garden is situated in the city, which is probably one reason for that. We realized that when we had about 2% of fruit set, so we had very little seed. And when we hand pollinated, we had about 50% fruit set. So obviously there is a lack of pollinators. So I assume that the reason is that we are in the middle of the city. And there is much more fruit set in wild populations out of the city where that we've seen.
Yeah, that it seems to be one of the challenges is understanding horticology, but also whether some of these populations are isolated from their natural pollinators or seed dispersers. It's something we see quite a lot with ex situ collections and even circa situ collections. Thank you. We have some other questions, and I'm going to share those around. We have a question here actually for both Dania and Sebsebi, so I will ask you both to respond. You've both talked about setting up your beautiful gardens and the necessity to redevelop them, to remove plantation areas and to essentially to rewild those gardens. How much of that was planned reintroduction of species, and how much of it made use of natural rewilding? In other words, you just let nature come back on its own. If I can start with Dania, and maybe Cecilia, you can translate that would be great.
Yes, of course. Dania, están preguntando acerca del proceso de convertir la granja de bananas y plantains al jardín botánico. ¿Cómo fue el proceso? ¿Cómo lo utilizaron? ¿Cuánto fue ustedes que limpiaron y que introducieron especies? ¿Y cuánto de ese trabajo fue natural, que llegaron las nuevas plantas y animales y todo eso?
Bueno, primero, el bosque tropical tiene la buena cualidad de que se regenera rápidamente si no hay perturbaciones. En esta parte del mundo...
Dania, permíteme nada más traducir eso. Poquito. So Danny is mentioning that the one fortunate thing about the one very positive thing about tropical forests is that they have a huge capacity for recuperation. Dania?
Sabemos que en esta parte del mundo los bosques sufren diferentes intervenciones. Por ejemplo, en Nicaragua, dependiendo del ecosistema, hay incendios, hay extracción de leña, hay extracción de madera. Y todas esas perturbaciones hacen que el bosque no se regenere como realmente se espera.
Okay.
Entonces, una ventaja...
Dania, permítame nada más traducir. The other thing that I missed on the previous comment was that they can recuperate, tropical forests can recuperate if disturbance is kept under control. So he's saying that, there's also fires, of course, there's also wood extraction. And so those things can slow down the recuperation process. Tania?
Dicho esto, el jardín botánico se ha convertido en un área protegida y eso ha facilitado que la regeneración del bosque sea relativamente rápida en el tiempo. De tal manera que en 11, 12 años ya tenemos un bosque juvenil.
¿Y
¿Cómo
cuánto
hicimos?
de eso fue reintroducción? O sea, ¿fue hecho en propósito? ¿Cuánto dirías tú de esos? El balance.
¿Cómo lo hicimos? Rápidamente les digo. La universidad tenía en ese espacio un banco de germoplasma de plátanos de Latinoamérica. ¿Qué hizo el jardín? Reducir ese banco de germoplasma a una pequeña representación y reintroducir especies de los ecosistemas que queríamos representar. Entonces,
Okay, so yeah, Zami is saying that the one vital step in the restoration of this area was protecting it. So it was protected from any further disturbance, and it was cleared. And then there was a big push in reintroducing protected species.
entonces el jardín tenía...
Rápidamente, si quieres cerrar con un comentario, Dani.
Lo que se hizo fue nada más dejar árboles representativos del ecosistema de bosque seco que ya estaban en el área y luego comenzar a reintroducir las especies de los diferentes puntos del país.
Okay, so the process was, just to close up, the process was to leave anything that they could find that was native. Especially there was some dry forest species trees. So those were left there and everything else was reintroduced and natural rewilding.
Great, thank you. Muchas gracias, Dania. Entiendo. That's, I'm always envious of tropical botanic gardens. I have met people in Uganda and Vietnam who tell me they can hear the trees growing. They grow so fast. In other places, it's more challenging. I suspect Ethiopia is one of those. Sebsebe, how difficult was it to remove those eucalyptus, and is that still going on?
Yes, well, to start with, Addis Ababa, the city itself, the area around Addis Ababa is naturally covered by a dry evergreen Afro-montane forest. That was the natural ecosystem. But once eucalyptus was introduced, eucalyptus actually affects the depths, the water underneath, and it also has some allelopathic effect. So not many plants would grow. Interestingly enough, Juniperus procera is such a fighter. As soon as you give it a space, as soon as you remove the eucalyptus, I think they really came by themselves. It was not so much introduction. So there were seedlings, but they were really given the opportunity. So much of the difficulty was to remove the eucalyptus because we don't want to affect the soil structure. So we just want it to have a natural death by debarking it. But once you remove the eucalyptus, I think most of the indigenous plants really came by themselves. So in some parts where we have the thematic garden for indigenous plants, we have introduced plants from other parts of the country so that to take care of endangered and threatened plants. Otherwise, in the general area, it really came from the natural seedlings underneath. So it was a seed bank. And really the important thing that we have learned is how Juniperus procera is a fighter and eucalyptus is a real fighter, but Juniperus procera is a native fighter. So we are now combating eucalyptus with the native tree. So it is now almost 70%. In a couple of years, we will have 100%. But to keep history, we want to also respect eucalyptus because it saved the town from firewood shortage. So we would really have a site where we will have eucalyptus plantations permanently, because that just shows us the history, and that also shows how the landscape, how the regeneration changed from eucalyptus to native plants. That's why we wanted to have this permanent ecological sites, including the eucalyptus site. Thank you.
Thank you. That was my next question. Noticing that your entrance is a eucalyptus leaf, and the logo there for Guleli, and also knowing the importance of eucalyptus to farmers in Ethiopia. Do you see any conflict there, or is that all sort of part of what a botanic garden does?
No, I personally, because there are people that really say we don't want to see eucalyptus, but I actually respect eucalyptus, because if there was no eucalyptus in Ethiopia introduced, there wouldn't have been any native tree left in the highlands of Ethiopia. So it really protected in a way, but you really have to do it in a measured way. If farmers, whether you like it or not, they would like to grow eucalyptus and sell. This is a cash crop for them. But in the Gulele Botanical Garden, we want to restrict the area for eucalyptus and have more native trees, but I'm not those that really hate eucalyptus throughout the country.
Thank you. So talking about the importance of economic species like eucalyptus, Ori, another one for you. I noticed that amongst your collections, you have crop wild relatives. We saw pears there and various others. Do you work at all with the Volcan Center or with the crop community? Because I think one of the things that we underestimate in botanic gardens is that we often hold important collections, economically important collections, including crop wild relatives, which are not necessarily available within the crop system. So
I would divide it into two. First, we are, like every botanical garden, we are a museum and an educational place. So we display everything, but we feel that this is just half of the job, as you said. And the connections to growers and the Ministry of Agriculture is very important. So we are working with the Research Volcanic Center, who their scientists are developing all kinds of new varieties. So, for example, you mentioned the pears. We have a large collections of wild crop relatives of rosaceae trees from Central Asia and the Middle East. So we've passed a lot of material that we were able to the research, to Dr. Doron Holland, who is a specialist on this group, for example, and he managed to do wonders with these plant materials.
Yeah, it's an important strand, I think, of our business, and one of the reasons that we are keen to develop this data and material exchange platform is to improve links with particularly the crop and forestry communities. We work closely with the Global Crop Diversity Trust over many years with their crop strategies, and have shared botanic garden collections, which are often highly complementary to those held within crop gene banks, because we tend to concentrate more on those wild relatives than on cultivars or land races. And I think we have a lot of hidden treasures in botanic gardens and arboreta that are extremely important for food security and for the conservation of agrobiodiversity, which gives us an opportunity to work much more closely with the crop community.
And I must say that I agree totally, but we feel a bit restricted with all the restrictions that we have with plant materials we get from all kinds of gardens in the world. So this also has to be reviewed.
Yeah, and it's actually become much more of an issue recently, partly because I think as research institutions, we are often either not regarded as research institutions or research institutions as a whole are not getting any special dispensation when it comes to customs or biosecurity and so on. It's becoming more difficult to exchange material for research purposes, and that's going to have impacts on conservation and also on research if our collections are not accessible.
Our policy, sorry, just one sentence. Our policy with plants that for us are free, plants that we've collected or we've developed, we are really giving it free to whoever is interested in, locally or internationally.
Yeah. Thank you. So I have another question from that's come through the Q&A here as well, and that's one saying, yesterday we heard about new tools to identify and prioritize areas of high diversity. In ex situ conservation, do you think there is potential to move towards a holistic approach to conserve communities of plants rather than cherry picking species? So it's really a question about whether our emphasis on species is appropriate, adequate, and whether we should be working more at the community plant level. Cecilia, I don't know if you are able to translate the gist of that to Dania.
Yes. Dania, Paul está preguntando en cuanto a tu opinión, en cuanto a tal vez hacer expander el trabajo de los jardines o reorientarlo para no solamente no tomar el punto de vista de especies, sino de comunidades. O sea, de que se está protegiendo comunidades enteras, que creo que tu jardín es lo que es un ejemplo, ¿no? Que ustedes estaban tratando de recuperar no especies en específico, sino comunidades, pero no sé, tú.
Sí, nosotros estamos intentando hacer representaciones de los ecosistemas más vulnerables de Nicaragua.
So Dania agrees, and she said that actually that is very much the way that they've kind of thought about their garden. They have actually worked very hard to build community, to build the tropical communities that are endangered in the country, and to represent them and protect them, but as an ecosystem, as a community, rather than focusing on specific species. Daniel?
Sí, entonces procuramos que las representaciones sean lo más natural posible, donde ocurren los procesos lo más natural posible. Entonces consideramos que el jardín nuestro no es un jardín convencional que va a tener muy arregladas las colecciones.
Permítame un momentito.
Sí.
So Dana is saying that they have focused on actually representing the communities very well. They are not, so they think that their garden in Nicaragua is quite special because they are not so interested in being tidy or presenting a garden with tags and everything. They are more interested in representing the ecosystems, the forests that are under threat, and that the people of Nicaragua need to know and value. Dania?
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. That's great. That's very clear. I'm going to also put another point of view across as the chairman's privilege here, and that is that if we don't concentrate and focus our efforts on species, my question would be who will? And one of the things that we find with mainstream conservation organizations is that they tend to focus on areas, on habitats, and holistic systems. But we have transformed more than 50% of the terrestrial landscape through transforming it to agriculture, forestry, urbanization, and so on. And there's a lot of biodiversity, species diversity, that still sits in those landscapes and that is not necessarily still living in protected areas, for example, or in fully functioning intact habitats. And I think there's a really important role for botanic gardens and for the botanical community to care for those species that may be isolated from the habitats that they originated in. They may be isolated from the pollinators or from dispersers. But I think something that we are good at is species conservation. And I think it's something also that our community uniquely knows about. You know, who else is going to do it? Sebsebi or Ori, any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have. I think I would really go back to your first original question is, I don't think it's a choice of one or the other. If you could do both, this is wonderful. For example, in the land use types that we have shown in Gulalle, we have areas to really keep the whole ecosystem intact, so we don't really interfere. So whatever grows in that area would be useful, and that would also serve as, you know, most of the trees would serve as mother trees for other landscapes, not only for Gulalle, but for other areas. On the other hand, we have areas, we have species that are definitely threatened in the wild. Where else would you bring them unless you bring them to the garden? For example, we have, you know, I think Boz, Ben, and Christy knows, we have one species that was really known in the wild in one place. And if we leave it there, it just will disappear in a year or two, or a couple of years at least. And the population is so limited. So what we have tried to do is bring it into the greenhouse and grow it there. And we just hope we will have more population and more seedlings. And we eventually, if things go better, we'll just take it back. So you can't say you can't grow it because, as you have rightly said, who would take care of individual species that are threatened, that are rare? And you can imagine, I think, I see a couple of, many years back, there were trees that were almost being extinct somewhere in Latin America, and the people were risking them to keep gardens. Where else? You can't take them back, but they have to be saved. It's like a child. You can't just allow it to die wherever it doesn't find food. So I think we have to do species protection, but also do ecosystem protection when we can. And Gulalle, we are lucky, we have 705 hectares, so we can have both. But what would you do for small gardens that are a couple of hectares? They have to save plants. They can't keep the whole ecosystem. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebsebi. And Ori, I'm going to give you the very last word because we need to bring this very interesting conversation to an end. But over to you. What are your thoughts?
I think I agree with all the things that were said, but we must be realistic. Many of our garden definitely is rather small and limited, so we cannot really do plant community research or conservation, although I've shown a slide of something we are doing with the annual plant communities. So we cannot take all the burdens on our small shoulders as botanical gardens. We have to collaborate with the nature authorities and forestry departments, which we do in Israel, and I think that would be the perfect combination.
Excellent final point to make, and that is that we need to find partnerships and work with wider society. But we do bring unique skills. I think we grow 1/3 of all known plant diversity in botanic gardens, and we have a huge amount of data and expertise in those gardens. Right, I've got a message which says time to close the Q&A. All that remains for me to do is to thank our panelists for your talks and also for a very interesting discussion. And to tell everybody that we have now a 20-minute break, or actually just a little less than that now. But please, for those of you who would return at 7 o'clock to hear our keynote address from Sir Peter Crane, my former boss. So please do come and join us for that. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.